Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final verdict on the new Sigma 45mm F2.8. This is DG for full frame, and it is DN, which is Sigma's designation for mirrorless. And so specifically, I am reviewing a copy that is designed for Sony FE, or full frame mirrorless. There is also a Leica variation of this lens as well. So I've done this test on a Sony a7R Mark III, so 42 megapixels. And so over the process of the last several weeks, I have put the lens through its paces and evaluated a lot of different aspects of its build, design, autofocus, image quality, etc. And so today we're going to try to put all those pieces together for you. First of all, if you missed it, I have a more thorough looking at the build, the features, and the design set here. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that particular video to give you more of those details. But typically, if there is a kind of a major indictment that I have of many Sigma lenses, it is that they tend to be on the large and heavy side of the spectrum. As you can see, that's not at all the case here with this little lens. And in fact, if I remove the significant lens hood, what you've got is a palm-sized lens that definitely is very compact, even though it is designed to cover the full frame 35mm image circle. And so it definitely gets good marks for its compact nature, for its compact size. It is lightweight, it is short in length. While not a pancake lens, it's not hugely different than that either. And Sigma has managed to pack a whole lot of goodness into the design here. In fact, the design is somewhat unique. I don't know that I've ever tested a Sigma lens that looks quite like this one. For one thing, this is the first Sigma lens that I've ever reviewed that had an aperture ring on it. And so what they have done is they've given you kind of the dual approach to aperture that, most notably on Sony, the G Master series does, and that you have an option to put it into A or automatic mode and handle all of the aperture from within the camera. But then you also have an aperture ring here where you can make your selections on the aperture ring with 1/3 stop detents. And it has a very nice, precise feel to it and very nice to use. Now, of course, some of you have pointed out that you find an aperture ring to be useless, particularly if it is not declicked, for use with in video work. Fair enough, although I will say that my personal preference is always to have that aperture ring. I find it to be the most intuitive way to control aperture, and also the fact that it's visually there as I'm going to think about a shot and set up a shot. I tend to be a little bit more aware of aperture, a little bit more intentional about how I use aperture. And so I'm personally a fan of having that. I'm also a fan of having an AF/MF switch right on the lens barrel, which this lens does. While again, you can control that from within the camera, having a physical switch is the quickest, most intuitive way to control that. And so I am a big fan of that. There's also a very nice feeling focus ring here that is very nicely damped. This is focused by wire, and so any kind of input here has to be routed through the focus motor, so the lens has to be attached to the actual camera, and then beyond that, the camera has to be powered on, and so that input will be flow through there. By the way, that's also true of the aperture ring. For example, right now I don't have a camera attached, so I can make changes to the aperture in terms of the aperture ring, but the aperture remains in the same position because it requires the camera to be on and the aperture to be powered by an electromagnetic aperture iris. You just have a secondary redundant control over it there. My only, criticism of the actual focus ring is not anything to do with the action of the focus ring itself. It feels very nice. It's ribbed in metal, very easy to grip, good texture to it. But because of the nature of the lens hood, there is very little space between the actual focus ring and the bottom end of the lens hood. And so when you're using it, it's a pretty tight fit for if you've got any reasonably sized fingers. There's not a lot of room there to grab it, and so it's much easier to physically grab without the lens hood attached. And maybe you're not a person that really utilizes a lens hood. I am. And if you don't utilize a lens hood, you're kind of missing out here, because this is an extremely nice lens hood. For one thing, it's actually all in metal, which is somewhat unusual. It has a nice ribbed texture that matches the rest of the lens. The whole lens itself is actually, even though it has a C or a contemporary designation on it, it's actually built in a premium fashion. It's all metal here. Very, very nice feeling. There is a gasket at the lens mount. There is no internal seals on the diagram. It's just a gasket at the mount, but a lot of good stuff going on there, and I'm a fan of the build, and I'm a fan of this basic design. It's got kind of a classic feel. It almost has a little bit, because of the nature of the design of the aperture and the focus rings that are somewhat raised and thin, it kind of gives you a feel of like a cine lens instead of a, typical SLR lens, or, in this case, a mirrorless but stills lens. So high marks for the build. Now, talking about the autofocus for a moment, the autofocus on this, it has a stepping motor built into it. The focus in most situations is very fast. It is very quiet in operation. It's quite quiet in making focus changes, focus pulls, as you can see from some of this footage here. And so, good marks for smoothness and all of that. I did find that there were a few situations where I ran into a fairly common problem on a number of lenses on Sony, and that is that sometimes with the aperture stopped down to landscape apertures in shooting a landscape scene, it will do a little bit of pulsing. That's particularly true if you have kind of the whole frame engaged. If you narrow down focus, it's a little bit more precise, but that is kind of the only real focus issue that I had, was that on occasions I felt like it just didn't grab anything really in focus, and but fortunately those were fairly few and far between, but it did happen, as you can see from these photos. IAF worked well, and I had good focus accuracy when a person was in the frame, and also in a portrait session I got good looking results and well focused results, because it did a good job of detecting the eye. And so no serious reservations about autofocus. Wouldn't be surprised to see somewhere along the way to see maybe a firmware update that will maybe further refine those focus algorithms to help with the closed down aperture focus. And so anyway, but there's a little bit of feedback on autofocus. In a secondary episode, we took a look at the image quality. And I recommend that you take a look at that, because the image quality in this lens is a really nuanced discussion. It's complicated. And so I recommend that you take a look at that, where we break that down in detail. So just to quickly hit some of the highlights of that, this is a lens that, if you read up on the intent of the engineers, and it's kind of interesting, there's an article out there that's made the rounds from a, kind of from a design perspective. And it noted that even though they're working with a only a moderately wide aperture of f2.8. And so to me, I've always got serious questions when a prime only has a maximum aperture of f2.8. Reason being is that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that people will elect for a prime lens over a zoom lens is that the prime lens often offers a wider maximum aperture option available, f1.4, f1.8, f2, etc. In this case, of course, this lens is no faster than what, say, the Tamron 28-75mm f2.8 zoom is, an extremely popular lens. In fact, it was the best-selling lens in the world last year. So it doesn't offer that advantage. What we also discovered is that depending on your focus distance, this lens also does not offer any kind of sharpness advantage. Now, what is somewhat unique is that this lens can actually focus down fairly close, and it has a very useful 0.25 times magnification, which blows the quite poor magnification of, say, the Samyang 45mm f1.8, blows it out of the water. Unfortunately, this lens is not very sharp at close focus distances, particularly when shooting wide open at f2.8. Fortunately, there is a significant improvement when you stop down to f4, where it is, becomes more equivalent sharpness at closer focus distances with, say, the Samyang or the Tamron zoom that I've mentioned. But wide open, it is quite soft and has fairly low contrast at those focus distances. What it has as a trade-off, it does have a uniquely soft bokeh rendering, to where the bokeh is very nice and soft, and that low contrast allows for a very creamy bokeh performance. Your challenges are in getting the best out of that in terms of those trade-offs. And so you can focus down quite close, but really the lens starts to get sharper when you get to about 2 meters, 6 feet and beyond. And so by that point, you don't really have a whole lot extremely out of focus. And so, you know, you have nice soft bokeh rendering, but you don't necessarily have a large quantity of bokeh. And so, and again, it's the maximum aperture, and then the lens does sharpen up the further that you get out. And so if you're out at, you know, say a distance of 10 feet, 3 meters and beyond, it's nice and sharp. And stop down to f4 and smaller, it sharpens up very, very nicely. But it is a, you know, unique lens, particularly for a Sigma, whom Sigma tends to optimize for, you know, high sharpness at wide apertures, and that's not really the case here. And so end of the day, the image quality is a nuanced discussion that, you know, you probably need to look at images and decide as to whether or not it's a lens for you. I've had anecdotal feedback from some people that have purchased the lens and they love the rendering from it. They, you know, recognize its limitations, but they love it anyway. Other people who just call it soft and write it off. And so, you know what, your mileage may vary. It really comes down to your shooting priorities. What does become a hard sale as I wrap things up is the fact that Sigma has priced this lens at $599 US. When one considers that that is, you know, about 2/3 of the price of the Tamron 28 to 75mm zoom, you know, that becomes a study in priorities. When one considers that that's $200 more expensive than the fairly excellent Samyang 45mm F1.8, which admittedly does not have as nice a build quality. It does not have nearly as much of a feature set, but optically it is quite good. And so, you know, the fact that this lens is $200 more also puts it at a little bit of a disadvantage when you're kind of looking at it from a performance to price ratio. So at the end of the day, this is a lens that I feel like is going to be a little bit more of a niche product. There are things that it does quite well. It's beautifully built, it has good autofocus, and it does have good, you know, color and rendering and good bokeh in certain situations. But the short focal length of 45mm combined with a only moderately wide maximum aperture of f2.8 means that you're not going to be producing large amounts of bokeh in almost any kind of circumstance. So at the end of the day, look at some photos, read some reviews. You're already watching one here. Maybe that will help you to make a decision for yourself. Speaking of that, if you look in the description down below, you will find that I have a full text review there with a lot of details. I actually evaluated a couple of copies of the lens to make sure that I was accurately reporting on it, because as I said, it is somewhat unique for a Sigma lens. So take a look at that. There's also linkage to an image gallery where you can go and look at photos that I've taken in a variety of situations. Maybe help you to determine whether or not the look is something that appeals to you. And of course, beyond that, there are buying links in the description if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. There's also linkage there to follow me on social media, to become a patron, or to sign up for my newsletter. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.